first with the machlokas about the arava. So the next one is Yavul Shishis, produce of the 6th year. Again, meaning even if it's grown in Eretz Yisrael, if it's the 6th year or earlier, there is obviously no Shemitah problem whatsoever. Again, let me review what defines whether produce is 6-year produce or 7th-year produce. Again, this is a chazara, but it's worthwhile to review. We divide all agricultural stuff into 3 categories. We have fruits of the tree, we have vegetables, and we have grain. And each of them has a different halacha as to when it belongs to year 6 and when does it belong to year 7. With respect to fruits, fruits are assigned the year of their budding, which is called chanata, which means to say, right, every fruit-bearing tree, if any of you ever see an apple tree or whatever it is, it produces flowers, and then there's a bud, and then the flower falls off, and a fruit, the bud becomes the fruit. That's called chanata in Hebrew. So a fruit is assigned to the year of chanata. That means if the chanata occurred in the 6th year, even if 90% or 99% of the fruit grew in the 7th year, that is a 6th-year fruit. It does not have the holiness of Shemitah. There is no problem with picking it, eating it, and the like. So for fruits, we follow chanata. For grain, we follow havoat shalish, the year in which it reached 1/3 of its full maturation. So if the 1/3 of the full maturation was in year 6, even if 2/3 was during Shemitah, it is 6th year. If, on the other hand, 1/3 grew in Shemitah and 2/3 after Shemitah, even after Shemitah, it has the holiness of Shemitah, and you have to follow all the halachas. Okay? Understand this. Fruit or any produce that has the holiness of Shemitah will extend past Shemitah as well. Now, with respect to vegetables, we look at when was it actually harvested. That's called lakita. Lakita b'shishis, it is shishis. Lakita b'shvius, even beheter. In other words, you harvested small quantities, has the halacha of peiros shvius. We call it peiros. Peiros, we include all produce of Shemitah, that it has the holiness of Shemitah. Now, there's a little complication here, and that is, for vegetables and grain, there is an additional concept that if it's Shemitah vegetables or grain, it's totally usher to eat because of the din of sapichim. But sapichim, the Chazon Ish says, is not governed by these normal criteria. And legabe sapichim, if any part of it grew before Shemitah, even if it reached 1/3 in the grain during Shemitah, or it was harvested for a vegetable during Shemitah, it has the holiness of Shemitah, that you can't waste it, and you have to eat it with proper sanctity, but it does not have the gzeira of sapichim. Okay, so it's a little complicated, meaning the rules of chanata, havas shalish, and lakita are true with respect to it being hefker, that you're not allowed to sell it commercially, you're not allowed to export it outside of Eretz Yisrael, you can't waste it, you have to throw it away in a special receptacle, not with other garbage. That will be based on chanata, havas shalish, and lakita. But sapichim, to totally prohibit it, that is actually a separate set of criteria, and there, if any part of it grew above the ground before Shemitah, it does not have the gezeira of sapichim. Which means, let's take something like a tomato. So if the tomato partially was beginning to produce a tomato before Shemitah, but it was harvested during Shemitah, that tomato does have the holiness of Shemitah, but it doesn't have the gezeira of sapichim. So sapichim is a separate criterion, or a separate category, that is governed by different criteria. Okay, but be it as it may, even shisha. So nothing in halacha is simple, really. It's a very simple statement to make that produce of the 6th year is not subject to the laws of Shemitah. That's a true statement, and in some ways that's an obvious statement. But there are complicated definitions. What is a 6th year fruit or when I say fruit, I mean, everything, a sixth-year agricultural commodity, and what is a seventh-year agricultural commodity. Yeah.
How do you measure whether food is grown to 1/3 or not? It's very hard to follow. Like the closest you say also like by Chadash, same thing as Shemitta also. How do you follow?
It is difficult, but some look at it just in terms of time, meaning to say if generally from planting to harvesting is X amount of time, so 1/3 of that time is already Havad Shlish. Others define it really as when is it ra'oi for an animal to eat? When would it be mature enough for an animal to eat? That's equal to the share of Havad Shlish. Yeah.
Halachically here, how do you define fruit and vegetables?
Okay, so basically it has to be a tree, meaning something that you have to plant every year is a vegetable. Something that there's a stalk that remains above ground and you don't have to plant it, that is considered to be a fruit. It's somewhat similar. I mean, it's a complicated question. It more or less is similar to the laws of brachos. When do you make brei pri ha'etz? When do you make brei pri ha'adama? There may be some differences. So, for example, a banana for Shemitta purposes may be deemed a fruit, even if for brachos purposes it's adama. But most of the time, it'll be the same types of definitions. Yeah.
Maybe a simple question, but is Orla applicable during Shemitta year?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Orla, right? Orla is a halacha only for fruit, right? Only for fruit. It does not apply to vegetables, but it does mean that the first 3 years from the time you plant a tree, any fruit that grows on the tree is considered to be totally prohibited because of Orla. Orla absolutely does apply during Shemitta, but Shemitta counts as one of the Orla years. Now remember, just to remind you, Orla runs from the planting of the tree, that for the next 3 years, any fruit that buds, any chanata that occurs within the 3 years is going to be an Orla fruit, right? That's going to be the definition. But the 3 years does not mean 36 months. Rather, if you planted a tree before Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av, then when Rosh Hashanah comes, that's called 1 year. And then Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah is year 2, and Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah is year 3, and then you have to wait until Tu B'Shvat, as it were. So the computation of Orla is a bit complicated, but it does not require 3 full years. Remember this about Orla, for some reason a lot of people get it wrong. I think I, probably speaking of my own confusion years ago, and that is, any fruit that is Orla is usher forever. People sometimes mistake Orla and say, oh, it's usher to eat the fruit for 3 years. No, that's not what it means. Any fruit that budded within a 3-year Orla period is forbidden forever. Orla does not have a heter after Zaman. Yeah.
If the Orla fruit was grown by a boy, is it permissible? And is the laws of Orla similar to Shemitta in that it only applies within the Eretz Yisrael?
Okay, so this is a little tricky. The halacha actually is that Orla is stricter than Shemitta. Orla does apply even in Chutz La'aretz, and Orla even applies to a non-Jewish tree. However, the Chachamim are mekel in Suffolk, meaning to say, if I buy an apple in Chutz La'aretz, and I'm not sure if it's an Orla apple or not, I am permitted to be lenient, which I would not be permitted to be lenient in Eretz Yisrael. But if indeed I know that it is Orla, I have to be strict even from a goy. So this has nothing to do with Heter Mechira. This is a law of Orla, and even in Chutz La'aretz. Also, keep in mind that every time a tree is replanted, it may start the Orla clock over again. So even if the tree is 10 years old, if it's you buy it from a nursery and you're going to replant it, it may be, it depends how much dirt is on the roots, etc. But every replanting of a sapling or a tree may, under some circumstances, re-trigger the clock, forbidding the fruit for the next 3 years, or however you count the years of Orla. So that's a major point, because most trees today are not planted from seed. I mean, it takes too long. I mean, I'm not going to buy apple seed, like Johnny Appleseed, and put down seeds and grow apple trees. People buy trees, right? You buy trees from nurseries, saplings or whatever it would be. So number one, the tree might still be within 3 years, but even if it's not, by replanting it, you may be creating an orla situation. Yeah. Oh, yeah, go first.
Does planting refer only to when it's directly in the ground? Or does it apply when it's like a potted plant, or maybe even hydroponics?
Yeah, so hydroponics is not subject to orla. A potted plant is similar to Shemitta problems. It kind of depends. If it's on a metal tray or a plastic tray, it's considered to be severed from the ground, and it may not have orla. But if, on the other hand, it's an earthenware pot that's resting on the soil, we may consider it to be connected. So some potted plants may, in fact, have a law of orla. Now, again, orla is only fruit. Orla b'chlal does not apply to vegetables or grain. There is never an orla problem with vegetables or grain. Okay? Alrighty. All right, so that's your question about orla. So we were just looking at the, all right, so we talked about, again, yavul, produce of chutz la'aretz, and then we mentioned produce of the 6th year, and then you have to have the special rules of what assigns something to the 6th year, and the sapichim exception to those classification rules. Yeah.
Are coffee beans considered a fruit in this regard?
Coffee beans, I believe, is a fruit. It simply grows on a tree, and it's a fruit, right? It's a regular tree.
Would there be an issue of orla by coffee beans also then, right?
Coffee beans of what?
There would be an issue of orla by coffee beans also then, I guess.
L'chayra there would be. L'chayra there would be, yeah.
So, like, there are places like in Yerushalayim that sell like coffee beans without any hechsher or any other. The Torah would need a hechsher.
Well, I mean, if you have no hechsher, you have a problem anyway. You have a problem of trumas and masros. I mean, you can't, in Eretz Yisrael, you can't buy coffee without a hechsher if for no other reason than trumas and masros. But you're correct, there could be an orla issue as well. However, let me point out, I mean, I'm not an expert in the different types of trees. There are a lot of trees that don't produce fruit for the first 3 or 4 years. It takes a long time. So there are minim in which bichlal there is never a chashash of orla, because pashut, the fruit is not produced until after that amount of time. By the way, there's a kasha. The Mishnah says in Tamura that peiros of orla are supposed to be burnt. They're not only usher to eat, but they are usher to get benefit from. You can't even sell them. And the halacha is that you can't feed them to your animal, because it's usher bahana. I could feed normal treif to my animal, but things like chametz on Pesach I cannot, because anything that is forbidden in benefit, not just in eating, you cannot sell even to a goy, and you cannot feed to your animal, right? That's the halacha. So the Mishnah says, because of that, you are mechuyev to burn orla fruit. Now I will tell you that we don't burn orla fruit. We tend to throw it in the garbage. Orla fruit, if you're a farmer, you throw it in the garbage. If you follow halacha, there is no halacha, there's no minhag today to burn orla. So I know that the Stipler had the kasha. The Stipler had a whole arichas into what is the halachic basis of our minhag that we don't burn orla like we burn chametz, even though the Mishnah itself says orla is isurim that you're supposed to burn. So it is a bit of a tzarachi, and why we don't completely follow what the Mishnah says about this. Okay, so again, yavol chol, yavol shishes. The next one, again, I know this is a review, so forgive me for reviewing, but since we spent a long time on Etra Mechira, I wanted to get back to the main road, so to speak, and that is matzah minutak. Now matzah, I don't mean unleavened bread with a hay, but matzah is mem tzadik ayin, which means a bed, like a bed of growth, nutrients and the like. Minutak, that is removed from the ground. Matzah minutak, and this is essentially things that are grown in greenhouses, in trays that either have soil, metal trays with soil in them, or hydroponically, just grown in water. The common denominator is it is not connected to the actual soil. It is minutak. It is separated from the soil, and it's also inside of a structure. 2 conditions: separated from the soil and inside a roof, a greenhouse roof. Again, everything in this world is a machlokas. There's very, very few things that everybody agrees upon. Matzah menutak has its own controversies, but many, many, many poskim say that the laws of Shemitta do not apply at all to greenhouse produce that is either grown hydroponically or in trays of dirt, which are separated from the ground. As a result, that permits both the farmer and the consumer, meaning the farmer is allowed to, the grower is allowed to cultivate these things because the agricultural restrictions don't apply. And I as a consumer can eat the vegetables, the grain, meaning there's no problem of sapichim, and there's no problem of kedushat shvi'it on whatever I eat. It's matzah menutak, which essentially is the same as shishit, meaning to say there's b'chlal no laws of Shemitah that are going to apply. Matzah, now again, the packages will tell you all these things. Matzah menutak, etc., etc. I haven't looked that much, but I have not seen, I don't recall even seeing matzah menutak in any package here, but I know it exists. My guess is it's probably expensive, because these things are like kind of organic stuff. It's grown more expensively. One advantage of matzah menutak, which is independent of Shemitah, is that essentially you don't have a bug problem. You don't have an insect problem because it's grown under these confined conditions. So that would be a plus, even not during Shemitah, to get those types of produce. Okay, so again, we've mentioned what? We've mentioned chutz la'aretz, we've mentioned shishit, we've mentioned matzah menutak. Then the fourth one is Yevul Nachri. Now here, now that we went through Heter Mechira, I want you to clearly see the difference between Yevul Nachri and Heter Mechira. Yevul Nachri simply means produce, fruit, vegetable, grain, that was produced by non-Jews working on non-Jewish land. Not the Heter Mechira, which is Jewish people working on land that was sold to non-Jews, right? That's the next one. We're talking about buying stuff that non-Jews produced by working on non-Jewish land. And there is a machlokas, but the minhag of Yerushalayim, the psak of Yerushalayim for hundreds of years, is Yevul Nachri, has no Shemitah restrictions whatsoever. There is no Isser of Sapichim on the vegetables and the grain, and there is no Kedushat Shvi'it on the produce. This is the Shita of Rav Yosef Karo, and this is the minhag of Yerushalayim, although Bnei Brak is Machmir. So we treat Yevul Nachri the same as Shishit and Chul and Matzah Menutak. There is no Shemitah problem at all in Yevul Nachri. And this is the position of the minhag Yerushalayim. The Yeda Charedis, it's a little confusing. On one hand, the Yeda Charedis is totally against the Heter Mechira. But Yevul Nachri, in fact, is commonly sold. Now, the main problem with Yevul, there are two problems with Yevul Nachri. One is a factual problem, and one is a moral, ethical problem. The factual problem is there have been some evidence of occasional unscrupulousness in which Arabs will buy produce from Jewish farmers who violated the laws of Shemitah, and the Jewish farmer will launder it through an Arab, a friendly Arab, and the Arab sells it. So consequently, when you're buying so-called Yevul Nachri, you're actually buying Jewish produce that didn't even have the benefit of Heter Mechira, that stamazai was farmed in violation of Shemitah. So the point is, you're not gaining anything. You're essentially buying Jewish produce. At a minimum, you'd have to keep Kedushat Shvi'it, and the grain and the vegetables would have an Isser Sapichim, right? So that's one problem. I don't know how prevalent the problem is, but there have been a number of cases where this has been identified as actually happening. The second problem, which I get criticized because I don't emphasize it enough, so I am going to tell you what it is. I'm not going to go crazy over it, but it is an issue, and that is, number one, Yevul Nachri means you're not supporting the Jewish people who are engaged in agricultural work, so you're depriving them of an income and a parnasa. Number two, which is even worse, is you might be funding and subsidizing terrorism. What's the pshat? I'm going to buy stuff from an Arab farmer in Gaza or on the West Bank? Well, what is he going to do with that money? buy a bomb, that'll blow up a bus. So some people are very, very concerned. They say, listen, you're fooling around with halachic technicalities. The machlokas, the Beis Yosef, and the Mabitz, if Yevul Nachri has the holiness of Shemitta, or does not have the holiness of Shemitta, and Minhag Yerushalayim is to paskin, like Rav Yosef Karo, that Yevul Nachri doesn't have Kedusha Shvius. Therefore, Baruch Hashem, it's a wonderful thing to buy it, because that way I don't have a Shemitah problem. Well, you may have a problem that's a lot worse than Shemitah. You're giving your money to people who might use the money to kill Jews in the land of Israel. Again, I get criticized because I don't yell. I don't say this loudly enough, but just my nature is not to scream so much, so forgive me. But it is a serious issue, and because of that, there are many people who feel that Yevul Nachri is actually a horrendous leniency that any person with a conscience should bichlal not support. Again, I'm not here to, since that's not a psak halacha per se, it's not a halachic matter, it's more of a matter of one's feeling, so I'm not going to tell you what to do on this, but just be aware that this is a major, major, major issue in Yevul Nachri. Now, Heter Mechira is also based on Yevul Nachri, but at least there, you're supporting the Jewish people who are working the land. I mean, they're the ones who ultimately will get the profits. Masha'en Kain, a pure paradigmatic Yevul Nachri, there is a fear of subsidizing terrorism. So there are two issues. One issue is who you're not helping, right? You're not helping, and by the way, that's the same problem with Yevul Chol. When you buy chutzlot, you're not helping the Jewish farmer. But the other is who you are helping, which is even worse, right? So be aware that Yevul Nachri is a very, very, very contentious topic, even though halachically, the Minhag Yerushalayim is to be mekel on Yevul Nachri. Yeah.
As a Jew, are we responsible if we go to a store and buy something from someone? Are we responsible for what that person does with his paycheck? Like maybe he uses the money to break Shabbos and go on a road trip. Like how? So when it comes to terrorism, like are we really responsible for what someone does with money when he buys something?
Well, there are levels and there are levels. I mean, obviously, anything you do, right? You sell a pot. Somebody may cook with the pot on Shabbos. They may use. You pay money in a store. They may use the money to gamble or to do all sorts of things. Normally, the psak halacha is I'm not mechuyev to do a religious check, so to speak, on the people that I give money to or that I sell something to. In fact, halachically, I can rent a car to a person even though they may drive it on Shabbos, etc. But the question is, at some point where the facts indicate that this has been going on, you can't really shut your eyes to what you know. And now, granted, you don't know that this particular guy that you're buying from is going to do something, but systemically, this money has been used in bad ways. So this is the Yevul Nachri. So be aware of this issue. Think about it, and you'll talk to people. Some people will get very, very, very angry over it. Other people kind of adopt your position. That listen, I don't know what people do with the money, and I can't automatically be responsible because otherwise, ein l'dover sof. You never know somebody's going to use your money with. So that's the machlokas about Yevul Nachri. Yeah.
So I guess somebody's already answered it, but what would be the direct answer of the Badasei the Haridis to this point of how giving money to Arab farmers can support? What's the response to that? It seems like if that's
the response is that okay. I don't want to get into this. I mean, the Eidach Haredis might say, so you give your money to a secular Israeli who's going to, be Mechal Shabbos, that's just as bad. They say giving it to the Jews is just as bad because they kill Israel in other ways. I mean, if you have a certain hashkafa about that, you don't consider terrorism necessarily, this is an awful thing to say, to be the biggest problem that Am Yisrael faces. Okay, I know that sounds a little crazy, but I don't know. I mean, basically, the concept is maybe it's a tunnel vision approach. I admit with that. In other words, we're looking at a halachic issue. Halachically, is there a problem with produce that is grown by non-Jews on non-Jewish lands? The Minhag Yerushalayim from the time of Rav Yosef Karo was there is not a halachic problem. If there's not a halachic problem, everything else is political. We're not involved in politics. Now, here's something interesting. Okay, maybe I shouldn't get into this, and we're going to get in trouble. But so, in a sense, what the Badatz is saying is, we only care about the kashrus of the product. We don't care about the other stuff that goes on. I mean, that's kind of there. Our job is kashrus. Our job is not politics and security. That's an interesting issue. It was an interesting issue, but I will tell you this. I think at one point, the Eida Charedis yanked a hashgacha on a product years ago. I think it was Pepsi at the time, because they ran a commercial involving dinosaurs. So the Badat said, we don't believe in dinosaurs. How can we give supervision on a company that talks about dinosaurs? So they did use like non-kosher considerations in that, and they routinely they will not give a hashgacha to places that may have mixed seating that allow women not tznius. So it is interesting that there are considerations other than the kashrus of the product that are used in hashgacha. So the idea that our job is only to certify the kashrus of the product and we're not involved in other stuff, there are inconsistencies. One could write a very interesting book. And I'm not talking about dishonesty here. I'm not talking about, God forbid, kashrus organizations that get bribed. I'm talking about what considerations in good faith should a kashrus organization take into account in certifying food and establishments. There is one approach that says, our job is simply to see that the ingredients are kosher. We don't care about anything else. Others say we got to include the environment, the atmosphere, the hashkafa, etc. That's actually an interesting machlokas in supervision standards, and that's been going on for a while. And as I say, sometimes the answer is inconsistent. So you might have a kashrus organization that will not certify Yevul Nachri if it's going to go to Arab farmers, in the state of Israel, because they say, that's immoral. And if it's immoral, we're not going to certify it. Others say, man, there's nothing to do with kashrus, right? That's a separate political issue. When the OU certifies marijuana brownies, and they say, we're not certifying the marijuana, we're just certifying the ingredients in the brownies. They say, we're just telling people it's kosher, Some people say, well, the OU shouldn't do that because they're kind of legitimating, they're putting their stamp of approval on marijuana, right? So it's kind of that same type of issue. Yeah.
Could you explain a little bit more? I think I'm having a little bit difficulty understanding how there's not like a halakhic problem in potentially supporting our enemies.
Well, listen, supporting our enemies. If I would, march a pro-Palestinian march against the immorality of Jewish settlements, I would say there is a halachic problem with that when I am directly supporting enemies, because obviously I'm giving chizuk and support to those who hate the Jewish people and want to kill the Jewish people. The question becomes, this type of economic support to farmers is more of a question, because not every farmer is a terrorist. Not every farmer is going to use the money for terrorism. So the question is, how much of a group identity do you say? Do you kind of say, these are terrorist people, therefore my money doesn't go to them? Or do I say, I don't know individuals. There are Arab farmers who are also struggling, to make a living, and I'm not mechuyev to kind of assume the worst about every single person I encounter. So, I would call this more of an indirect support problem than a direct support issue. Yeah.
Would you say that if just a few farmers happen to support terrorism, they could be middled in the road?
Well, listen, I don't want to make light of this. Unfortunately, no matter what your bittul barov is going to be, there's no bittul barov on lives that are going to be lost. Even if it's 1 out of 10,000, the terrorist is not batal. He's still going to be. And this is what they say about Muslims. I don't want to. There are good Muslims in the world, 100%, but they say, people say 95% of the Muslims are peace-loving and fine people. Let's assume that's true. When you have, more than 1 billion Muslims in the world. So let it be 95% are wonderful tzaddikim. So that leaves you with 5%. What's 5% of 1 billion? Quite a lot. Much larger than the population of the state of Israel. So 99% of them are great. But 1% is such a huge number that we're really, really at the victim. I mean, that's what happens. When you have large enough numbers, percentages don't really help you that much. You don't need, 6 billion terrorists in the world to make life dangerous. 1 million is going to be enough. And unfortunately, these are the numbers that you're talking about in some cases. Okay. Alrighty. So this is Yevul Nachri. So again, on one hand, Yevul Nachri is relatively halachically simple, although B'nai Brak, the Chazon Ish, by the way, was Machriya Nato. The Chazon Ish was Machriya that Yevul Nachri does have Kedushat Shviyit, but it doesn't have an Isser Sapichim, because that's a special separate thing. That is the minhag of B'nai Brak, and many B'nai Torah follow it, but the minhag Yerushalayim is Yevul Nachri is much. Okay, so again, our list, we've talked about 4 things very quickly. Again, I know this is Chazara. Yevul Chol, Yevul Shishis, Matzah Minutak, Yevul Nachri. Okay, now we come to number 5, where we spent last week talking about Heter Mechira. Heter Mechira, what is Heter Mechira accomplishing? Those who matir the Heter Mechira, basically say that once the land is sold to a non-Jew, even pro forma, a Jewish farmer is permitted to farm the land. A Jewish farmer is permitted to farm the land. So number 1, therefore, that gives him a parnasa. And number 2, even though technically the land belongs to the guy, but you're not supporting terrorism in any way because it's going to the Jewish farmer. And if you hold of the Heter Mechira, there is no Kedushat Shviyit on the produce, and there is no Isser Sapichim. Without going over this biarichos, you'll recall, though, that those who are against the Heter Mechira either say the sale is a joke, which I thought was a weak argument, or they say the sale is prohibited because of the issue of selling land to a goy. And the third point they make is that it doesn't help anyway because if a Jew is doing the work, a sale to a goy doesn't take away the agricultural restrictions. Right? Those were the anti, those who were pro. Rav Kook, again, just to remind you, was not the inventor of the Heter Mechira, but he was the one who really established it. But many say he only did so, in fact he himself says it, because of the starvation conditions. He would not endorse it today. Politically, the advantage of the Heter Mechira is that it does give parnasa to Jewish farmers, number 1. And the second political advantage is it creates a minimal Shemitah observance of people who would otherwise not observe Shemitah. Meaning to say, many Chilonim who would have they would have no problem with just working the land during Shemitah. So this creates a mechanism where the Rabbanut gets them to sign to a Heter Mechira, so at least it allows them to keep Shemitah, according to some opinions at least. In fact, that's the whole raison d'etre of Rabbanut Hashgacha generally. In other words, the Rabbanut's kashrus supervision may to some degree have lower standards, but it's l'shem shamayim why there are lower standards, because lower standards means cheaper supervision. Meaning if I run a store or a restaurant, a Rabbanut hechsher is cheaper than a Mahadran hechsher. So, I may not be willing, if I'm not religious, I may not be willing to pay for a Mahadran hechsher. So if the only hechsher that's available is a Mahadran standard, I will operate my restaurant without any hashgacha whatsoever. Now, maybe it won't be treif. No, it's possible. Or maybe it will be treif. Possible. So, by the Rabbanut's argument, that by offering what you might call a bargain basement hashgacha, we are at least creating a more kosher environment than would be the case if the bargain basement hashgacha would not be available. Again, interesting questions. Meaning, we are offering, and I don't want to call it a substandard, but what some people might call, again, this is not my label, but some people might call a substandard because substandard is better than zero. And as a result, we're creating overall an environment where it's more likely people will be kosher than they will not be kosher, right? And according to that, Heter Mechira can be viewed in the same way. It allows Chiloni farmers who would otherwise violate Shemitah with no compunction whatsoever to at least have something to be somech on. Now, of course, I do want to point out, not every farmer joins Heter Mechira. I mean, you have Charedim who keep Shemitah in the other ways, and you have Chilonim who don't do Heter Mechira. I mean, there are farmers who won't even do that, and they'll do what they want, and and that's not good. They're simply violating the laws of Shemitah. Okay, so that's Heter Mechira. So we've mentioned 5 options, right? So the 6th option, which I'll say for tomorrow, is a really, really interesting one. And this is called the Otzar Bastin option. Let me just introduce what the concept is. The Otzar Bastin is for a farmer who wants to keep the laws of Shemitah. He does not want to sell his land to a guy. He wants to observe the agricultural restrictions, but he still wants to make a living from his produce, like fruit, and the way he does so is the produce is hefker, so you cannot make money on Shemitah produce, but you can be compensated for labor and transportation costs. So Otzar Bastin, again, I'll flesh it out tomorrow in more detail, is a distributional method that allows Jewish farmers who want to keep the laws of Shemitah to make a parnasa, not by selling their land to Goyim, but by permissibly doing what they're allowed to do and not getting paid for the produce, but getting paid for their labor. And the thing with an Otzar Bastin store is that the produce is Kedushat Shvius. It is Kedushat Shvius, and technically when you have Otzar Bastin stores, you're getting your bananas and apples for free, but you're paying transportation and labor, which essentially is adjusted to essentially give the Jewish farmer a salary for what he's doing. So there's a common denominator between Heter Mechira and Otzar Bastin, and that is economically, both are ways that a Jewish agricultural producer will be able to get a parnasa during Shemitah. But the difference is that the Heter Mechira is predicated on selling the land to a non-Jew, allowing the Jewish farmer to do everything. Otzar Bastin, B'dafka, does not sell the land to the non-Jew, but the cost of that is that what the Jewish farmer can do is extremely limited. There's not a lot he can do. He can essentially just let the trees grow and prevent them from dying. He really cannot fertilize. He cannot do any of that stuff. But he's able to make a living by getting compensated for transportation costs and production costs. So there's a big machlokas among people. Is Otzar Bastin better than Heter Mechira? Is Heter Mechira better than Otzar Bastin? Heter Mechira is rejected by the Haredi world. Otzar Bastin is embraced by many Haredim as well. But again, Otzar Bastin actually means it has Kedushat Shvi'it, and you have to follow all of the Shemitah halachos. It also means that Otzar Bastin will have an Isser Sapicha, meaning Otzar Bastin will only give you fruits. You will not be able to get grains or vegetables via the Otzar Bastin mechanism unless they comply with the Chazon Ish that they began growing beforehand. That's a possibility. But by this time of the year, which is already late in the year, you will not. So Otzar Bastin has its limitations. Number one, the fruit itself may not be of optimal quality because there was a lot of cultivation that couldn't have been done. So the fruits may be small, a little inferior. And number two, Otzar Bastin has an Isser Sapichim because it's Jewish land, so grains and vegetables are going to be prohibited. So be aware of that. And Otzar Bastin is not a panacea. The Heter Mechira, if you rely on it, will give you grains and vegetables as well. The Otzar Bastin will only give you fruit unless you have the Chazon Ish's Sapichim. In other words, it began to grow before him, which is a separate Heter, but an Otzar Bastin store will have that as well. Okay? But we'll talk a little bit more about the Otzar Bastin tomorrow.